think I need to be the host in order to share my screen.
Okay, Hamzah, you should be co-host now. Let me know if you're good. Awesome.
Okay, and then you guys can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so we'll get started. Yeah. This is a oh, also guys, I have a younger Palestinian cousin who's here. His name is Yusuf. So I wanted to start off by shouting out Yusuf. Yusuf, how old are you? You're 12?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Yusuf is 12 and he's a young activist in the making. So yeah, we'll get started.
Wait, so sorry, Hamzah. Yusuf, are you in Orlando?
No, I live in New Jersey.
You live in New Jersey? If you come to Orlando, you can be on the PSA board.
Okay.
We would be honored to have you be a part of PSA, and maybe you could become president. I mean, you are going to become president, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
awesome.
Yeah, so we'll get started. I guess like the first place that we'll start actually is when you hear the word apartheid, and you guys can just type this into like the chat box. When you hear the word apartheid, what is like the first thing that comes to your head? Okay. Someone said South Africa, someone said Nelson Mandela, someone said South Africa, Palestine, South Africa, Africa, segregation. Israel. Okay, yeah. So most people see apartheid as almost like a locational thing or like a historical thing. And we'll keep that in mind as we go. And yeah, and these pictures are very cool. So this first picture is a statue of Nelson Mandela, and it was gifted to the city of Ramallah in Palestine from the city of Johannesburg. And it's the only statue of Nelson Mandela built by the South African government outside of South Africa. So it shows a very kind of strong affinity that South Africans have for the people of Palestine. And then this is a picture with Nelson Mandela and Leila Khalid, who was a Palestinian resistance fighter from the So the first thing that we'll go over is kind of what South Africans have said about Israel being an apartheid state. Then we'll go into like what is apartheid. Then we'll go into kind of historical kind of parallels between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. Then we'll ask the question of how Israel is like apartheid South Africa. And then we'll answer the question of how Israel fits the legal definition of apartheid. So we'll start off with, probably the most famous South African in the world, Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela, after the fall of apartheid, he's giving a speech where he says the UN took a strong stand against apartheid, and over the years, an international consensus was built, which helped bring an end to this iniquitous system. So he's saying apartheid ended. And then he says, but we know all too well that our freedom is incomplete without that of the Palestinians. And he says, all of us need to do more in supporting the struggle of the people of Palestine. So this is a very powerful statement. Nelson Mandela is essentially saying that apartheid is over in South Africa, but we know that apartheid has not ended completely until Palestinians are free. And then he says, the histories of our two peoples, Palestinian and South African, correspond in such painful and poignant ways. And then he says, we identified with the PLO, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, because just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right to self-determination. And he says that Yasser Arafat is a comrade in arms and we treat him as such. And this was in 1990. So this was 4 years before apartheid fell. And Nelson Mandela actually said this in the United States. And there were very, very many groups who basically said to Nelson Mandela that, we think apartheid is really bad in South Africa, but it really bothers us that you have this close affinity with the Palestinians. And, we want to put sanctions on South Africa. We want to do all these sorts of things, but we want you to kind of drop your kind of allyship with the Palestinians. And Nelson Mandela refused, and he said, no, Yasser Arafat is a comrade in arms. And then on multiple occasions, Nelson Mandela called the struggle of the people of Palestine the greatest moral issue of our time. And then Desmond Tutu, who recently passed away, who after Mandela, so Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, they both won Nobel Peace Prizes for the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And he's probably the second most famous South African after Mandela. And he said that Israel is an apartheid state. He said, I go and visit the Holy Land and I see things which are a mirror image of the things that I experienced under apartheid. And then he said, I've been to the occupied Palestinian territory and I've witnessed the racially segregated roads and housing that remind me so much of the conditions we experienced in South Africa under the racist system of apartheid. And then Nelson Mandela's wife, Winnie Mandela, and here she's pictured with members of the Palestinian Authority when they were visiting South Africa. And she said, apartheid Israel can be defeated just as apartheid South Africa was defeated. And then Mandla Mandela, who's Nelson Mandela's grandson, who's currently a member of parliament in South Africa and probably one of the most kind of prominent political figures in South Africa. He said, Israel is the worst apartheid regime in human history. What we have experienced in South Africa is a fraction of what the Palestinians are experiencing. I think it is a total disgrace that the world is able to sit back while such atrocities are being carried out by apartheid Israel. He says, we demand that all ties be cut with Israel, no trade ties and no travel. We demand that Israel complies with international law and demand the return of 6 million Palestinian refugees driven from the land of their birth. We demand that all occupied land be returned, and we condemn the continued expansion of illegal Israeli settlements on Palestinian land. We stand to salute the brave and fearless Palestinian people who are facing the brutal might of the Israeli army to defend Al-Aqsa with their bare hands. We demand all occupied land be returned. And when he's referring to Al-Aqsa here, he's referring to Masjid al-Aqsa, which is one of the holiest sites in Islam. And this was a fairly recent statement after he had gotten back from a visit to Palestine. And if you follow Mandla Mandela on Instagram, it's actually really interesting. Like almost like every fifth picture, he's like wearing a keffiyeh. He's someone who's very passionate about his support for the Palestinian cause. And then Ahmed Kathrada, who was Nelson Mandela's cellmate in prison. And he was an Indian South African, and he was one of 8 people sentenced to life in prison with Nelson Mandela for essentially trying to overthrow the apartheid government. He visited Palestine, and he said, in our short stay here in Palestine, we have seen and heard enough to conclude that apartheid has been reborn here. In its reborn form, it is, however, worse than its predecessor. Even during the worst days of apartheid, we did not have walls to divide and control people. We also did not have separate roads for separate races, and we did not have the system of checkpoints that exists here. Balika Mbete, the former chairwoman of the ANC and the former Speaker of Parliament of South Africa, she authored a resolution in which the African National Congress called Israel an apartheid state, and then also endorsed a certain solidarity campaign that I'm not allowed to mention because of Florida's anti-BDS laws. But she said that she's been to Israel, and she said it's not only an apartheid state, but it's far worse than apartheid South Africa. And then Dennis Goldberg, who was a white Jewish South African, who was also jailed with Nelson Mandela. He's one of the 8 people jailed with Nelson Mandela at Rivonia. He was sentenced to life in prison for trying to overthrow the apartheid state of South Africa. He said, there's no doubt in my mind that Israel is an apartheid state. Having lived through apartheid in South Africa, I cannot allow in my name the same kind of oppression to go on. And then Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, he said very recently in response to the events going on this summer in Sheikh Jarrah, he said the sight of men, women, and children being evicted from the homes of that their families have lived in for generations brings painful collective and personal memories for the majority of South Africans. It was a pain and humiliation faced by my own family and by many South African families. My family was forcibly moved to different parts of the country on 2 occasions. For all who believe in equality, justice, and human rights, we cannot but be moved and indeed angered at the pain and humiliation being inflicted on the Palestinian people. So and I think this is actually the strongest argument for whether Israel is an apartheid state or not. If you ask any South African who was involved in the liberation struggle, without exception, virtually every South African will say that Israel is an apartheid state. And if anyone knows apartheid, it's the family of Nelson Mandela, it's Desmond Tutu, it's the president of South Africa, it's these people who are struggling to end it in South Africa. So when these people go and they say that Israel is not only an apartheid state, but it's much worse, that's a very, very strong statement. And that's probably the strongest argument that Israel is an apartheid state. And then we kind of have to answer the question of what is apartheid? Because apartheid is two things. And apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means apartness. And Afrikaans was a language that was developed by the Dutch who moved over, who colonized South Africa. And they sort of developed their own language that was a little bit different from the Dutch that was being spoken. So it's almost identical to Dutch, but there are some Malay words in there. There are some other words in there. And apartheid is Afrikaans for apartness or like separation. So when we refer to apartheid, we can either say that this refers to the historical reality of the system of government created by the Afrikaner government in South Africa from 1948 to 1994. So like when I asked the question at the beginning of what is apartheid, people said South Africa, South Africa, South Africa, right? Apartheid is a kind of historical reality. So when we say Israel is an apartheid state, one thing we could be saying is we're drawing a comparison historically, that Israel is like South Africa. But the other kind of thing that apartheid is apartheid is a legal definition. So international law, things like the Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute, after the fall of apartheid in South Africa, they said that apartheid is a legal crime against humanity. And that legal crime against humanity has three primary elements. That's an intent to maintain a system of domination by one racial group over another, by systematic oppression of one racial group over another, and by one or more inhumane acts carried on a widespread or systematic scale. So when Human Rights Watch, which recently said that Israel is an apartheid state, when they say that, they're saying it's a legal definition. And the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute, when they're defining apartheid, they never even use the word South Africa. They have one reference to Southern Africa in the entire document. But apartheid is a legal definition, kind of in that sense. And this is what groups like Human Rights Watch and Bet Salem and Amnesty International, that's what they mean when they say that Israel is an apartheid state. But today we'll kind of explore kind of both definitions. So the first thing that we'll ask is, if we're drawing a historical comparison idea of apartheid, how is Israel like apartheid South Africa? And the first thing is that it's settler colonization premised on religious nationalism. So the ideology that guides the state of Israel is Zionism. And Zionism is premised on the belief that European Jews have the right to drive out Palestinians out of their historic homeland based on the idea that God promised that land to them because they are his chosen people. And Afrikaner nationalism, which was based on the Afrikaner Calvinist teachings of the Dutch Reformed Church, that was the guiding ideology of apartheid. And it was premised on the belief that Dutch people who had migrated to Southern Africa and called themselves Afrikaners, they had the right to subjugate and take control of the land from the non-white people in South Africa. And this was based on the idea that God promised the land to them because they are his chosen people. So both Zionism and apartheid and Afrikaner nationalism are based on this idea that Europeans have the right to go into a place and take it from the native people because God made them superior to the darker people. So those are kind of the two, that's the kind of guiding forces of both of these ideologies. And then the other kind of parallel is that they subject different racial groups in the same area to different laws. So if I was living in apartheid South Africa and I am a white person, I am a full citizen of the country. I have the right to do whatever I want. If I am a Black person living in apartheid South Africa, I don't have any rights. I'm not a citizen of the country, but I pay taxes to that state. I do everything to that state. That state controls me, but I don't have citizenship. I can't vote in elections. I can't do all these sorts of things, right? In the West Bank, in Palestine, Palestinians and Israeli settlers live in the same strip of land, but those Israeli settlers are considered full citizens. They can vote in elections. They're allocated water by the government. Israeli settlers in the West Bank probably have more rights than Israelis anywhere else because the government also gives them protection. And if I'm a Palestinian, I'm not a citizen of that state. Even though Palestinians pay taxes to the state of Israel, they give everything to the state of Israel. The state of Israel controls them, but they are not citizens of that state. And even Palestinian citizens of Israel, Israel has over 70 laws that discriminate against them, essentially relegating them to second-class citizenship. And this is kind of the other kind of parallel that apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel have. That in apartheid South Africa, it wasn't just white people and black people who were kind of discriminated against, but they essentially created this racial ladder. So when the apartheid regime talked about white and black, black included anyone who was not white. So Africans, so-called coloreds, which was a term used by the South African government, and Indians, they would all be considered black. But there would kind of be this racial ladder. So white people had the most rights. Indians had less rights than white people, but they had more rights than the so-called coloreds and the Africans. And then the so-called coloreds, and the coloreds would consist of, if a white person and a black person got married and had a child, that child would be classified as a colored, but there were also Malaysian slaves who were brought over by the Dutch, who make up a significant part of the South African population. And many of them intermarried with the indigenous Africans. So these kind of Malaysians, and basically anyone who was between Indians and Africans in pigment, they would be in the colored category. So so-called coloreds, they had less rights than Indians, but more rights than Africans. And then the Africans would have the least rights of anyone. But none of these latter three groups would be citizens of the country. And then in apartheid Israel, you see the same racial ladder. So European Jews have the most rights in the state of Israel. Arab Jews have slightly less rights, and they're almost taught to kind of be ashamed or embarrassed of their Arabness, that it's something bad. And below them are African Jews. And African Jews in the state of Israel, particularly Ethiopian Jews, have faced a lot of discrimination. The Israeli government was actually found to be forcibly sterilizing Ethiopian Jews without them even knowing. And then they're followed by Palestinian citizens of Israel who have, less rights than the former three groups, but more rights than West Bank and Gazan Palestinians. And then you could actually argue that West Bank Palestinians probably have slightly more rights than Palestinians in Gaza. But there's kind of this racial ladder to help kind of maintain the system of domination. And then the other thing that you'll have are forced removals. And this is Muna al-Kurd right here, who was actually in South Africa 2 months ago. And she posed in front of a picture of South Africans in Sofia town, who the South African government was trying to forcibly evict from their home, and they say, we won't move. The same kind of parallel to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah right now. So in 1950, the South African apartheid government passed their first version of the Group Areas Act, and it was designed to give white people the most central and most fertile land, and it resulted in 3.5 million South Africans being forcibly removed from their home. And if you look at pictures of this happening, you see that it almost looks like what Palestinians are going through. Bulldozers, the whole 9 yards. And Israel, in the last 15 years alone, it's demolished 1,100 Palestinian homes, leaving Palestinians homeless so that Israelis can move in there. And this was exemplified by the attempted demolitions in Sheikh Jarrah this summer. And the purpose of these demolitions are to give the European Jews or the white South Africans the most fertile and the most kind of ideal land. So if you look at South Africa right now, like if you were to go to Johannesburg today, the historical, white areas, though, that's where the universities are. That's where the downtown is. That's where everything is. Whereas the colored areas, the Indian areas, the black areas, those are on the outskirts of town where people are unable to have access to the kind of resources that the city provides. And then checkpoints and passbooks. So in apartheid South Africa, if you were white, you could just walk around wherever you want. If you were not white, you would have a passbook that would identify you as a black, an Indian, or a colored, and anyone not carrying a passbook would be jailed or fined. And police would often raid homes, and if someone was found to not have a passbook on them, they would be arrested. And in Palestine today, this is like checkpoints on steroids. Like when Ahmed Kathrada, Nelson Mandela's cellmate in jail, went to Palestine, he was like, wow, I've never seen checkpoints like this. In the West Bank, Israel has 522 roadblocks or checkpoints that prevent Palestinians from freely moving without showing a permit to travel through. And over here, we see just a typical Israeli checkpoint in the West Bank. It can take anywhere from like 3 to 4 hours for a Palestinian just to get through to there. And then the other parallel is indefinite detention. So in 1967, the South African apartheid government passed the Terrorism Act of 1967, making it so that someone suspected of terrorism could be indefinitely imprisoned without being charged for anything until all questions were answered. And many people would be held for years without being charged for a crime. And Israel allows its military to do the same thing to Palestinians. They can be held secretly without charge, without being told what they are being held for. And 800,000 Palestinian men, 40% of the population of the West Bank, has been detained in Israeli prisons at one time in their life, which is a crazy statistic. And Israel is also the only government in the world that makes it legal to indefinitely detain children. And then it's kind of very obvious that the apartheid government of South Africa is anti-Black, and it's very obvious that the Israeli government is Islamophobic. But what's interesting is that the South African government, in the apartheid South African government, was also Islamophobic, and the Israeli government is also anti-Black. So Israel presents itself as this bastion of Western values in an inferior part of the world. And South Africa presented itself as a bastion of Western values in an inferior part of the world. And there's a 1978 document from the apartheid government where they say that Israel and South Africa have one thing above all else in common. They're both situated in a predominantly hostile world inhabited by dark peoples. And the South African government, they also spoke of two main threats, that of communism and that of Islam. And one of the reasons that the South African apartheid government was very kind of threatened by Islam is because Muslims were kind of disproportionately involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. So Muslims make up about 1% of the they made up about 1% of the population of South Africa then, but there were very, very many Muslims involved in the anti-apartheid struggle from the Indian community and from the so-called colored community. So Ahmed Kathrada, Nelson Mandela's cellmate in jail, is a Muslim. Nelson Mandela's grandson, Mandla Mandela, he actually converted to Islam. And that's why when he's talking about Palestine, he brings up Masjid al-Aqsa. And Muslims in 1994, they were 1% of the South African population, but they made up 16% of the first parliament. The first Supreme Court Justice of South Africa is Muslim. So the South African government was very concerned about Muslims because they saw it as an extension of their Islamic values to resist apartheid. And for that reason, they were probably more involved than really any other kind of religious community per capita. So the apartheid government had the sphere of communism and the sphere of Islam. And the Israeli government also has this kind of Islamophobia, but also this anti-Blackness to it. And there's a Daily Beast article that was published a couple of years back, and it showed that Israel's most liberal city, Tel Aviv, built separate kindergartens for the children of African immigrants from Sudan and from Eritrea and from Ethiopia, because these white liberal kind of European Jewish people who live in Tel Aviv, they didn't want their children going to schools with Black people. So they built segregated kindergartens essentially to kind of rid this problem. And Israel was also found to be forcibly sterilizing Ethiopian Jews. And then there's also a deep camaraderie between Israel and apartheid South Africa. So Israel was the biggest weapons supplier of apartheid South Africa, and Israel also sold them a nuclear weapon. And part of the negotiations from apartheid to democracy was that that South Africa would get rid of their nuclear weapon. So currently South Africa does not have any nuclear weapons because they were all destroyed when they were transitioning from apartheid to democracy. So the apartheid government had nuclear weapons. Nelson Mandela's government did not. And apartheid South Africa's military chief, Constant Viljoen, he was an admirer of Israeli checkpoints when he visited. So he said the thoroughness with which Israel conducts this examination is astonishing. At the quickest, it takes individual Arabs that come through there about 1.5 hours. When traffic is heavy, it takes 4 to 5. So apartheid South Africa's military chief basically said, like, wow, these checkpoints are great. We wish we had these in South Africa. And white South Africans were required to do mandatory military conscription, just as Israelis were required to do. But one of the ways that white South Africans could get out of it was if they joined the Israeli army. So the apartheid government, they wanted every single white South African male to join the South African army for 2 years so they could oppress black South Africans. And the only exception was to go join the Israeli army. And Hendrik Verwoerd, the prime minister of South Africa from 1958 to 1966, in the 1960s, he says Israel, like apartheid South Africa, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. But he's not saying it in the sense that we would say it today. This is way before apartheid was a crime against humanity, when it was kind of this bad word. Before, it was just the system of how they organized their government. And these white South Africans were very proud of apartheid, similar to how Israelis talk about Zionism. Zionism is becoming a bad word, but before Zionism was a bad word, these people will proudly say we're Zionists. So just like that, people would proudly say, yeah, we support apartheid. So the former prime minister of apartheid South Africa says, like, Israel, like us, is also an apartheid state. You have the same values that we have. And there are also similar arguments against those who criticize the apartheid South African government. So one of those arguments were, so you'll oftentimes hear this argument, right? People will say, why do you single out Israel? Why don't you criticize, X other government? And South African solidarity activists were often asked the same thing. Jesse Jackson in 1985, he was on a TV show where he was advocating for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And Jerry Falwell, who was kind of the face of the evangelical kind of Christian right, he said to Jesse Jackson, he said, why do you only boycott South Africa? Why haven't you marched against the Soviets or the Red Chinese? And on October 12th, 1989, the Christian Science Monitor wrote an article called South Africa Shouldn't Be Singled Out. So anytime anyone says to you, oh, why do you only criticize Israel? Why do you single out Israel? Why not criticize, this government or that government? Just know that they're making the same arguments that were made to defend apartheid in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress were also called terrorists. And the US government actually stopped classifying Nelson Mandela as a terrorist in 2008. So this language of terrorism is also something that has been used in both places. And then we should also ask, why is Israel not like apartheid South Africa? Or how is Israel not like apartheid South Africa? And I spoke to Naim Jinnah, who is a former anti-apartheid activist. His brother actually died resisting apartheid in South Africa in the 80s. And he's currently the executive director of what's called the Afro-Middle East Center. And the Afro-Middle East Center is the biggest think tank in Africa that works on Middle East policy. And he said to me, he said, we never had in South Africa fighter jets or helicopter gunships flying over our townships and dropping bombs, never. This is despite the fact that in its day, the South African arms manufacturing industry was pretty advanced. South Africa was manufacturing some of the most advanced gunships in the world. We never saw those in our towns. This is routine in the West Bank and Gaza. Dropping bombs from planes and drones is routine. It happened this weekend again. Tanks and soldiers in the West Bank are not just equivalent to our townships, but also in cities. It is routine in Palestine. So at all of these levels, the Palestinian experience of apartheid is much heightened, much intense, and much worse. So never in the history of apartheid South Africa did F-16 missiles fall in a black township, like we see in Gaza every couple of years. Never in the history of apartheid South Africa did they prevent food and people from getting into a township, like we see with the blockade of millions of people in Gaza today. So in many sense, apartheid Israel is not just an apartheid state, but it's much, much worse. And then Noam Chomsky, he said to call it apartheid is a great gift to Israel because they're so much worse. He's like, at least if by apartheid, you mean South African style apartheid. What's happening in the occupied territories is much worse. There's a crucial difference. The South African nationalists needed the black population. That was their workforce. The Israeli relationship in the occupied territories is totally different. They just don't want them. They want them out or at least in prison. So this is also a crucial kind of difference between apartheid in Israel and apartheid in South Africa. White South Africans were reliant on a subjugated workforce that would do things for them. Black people were their maids. Black people were their workers, their menial jobs, all of this sort of stuff. In Israel, if you go to Israel today, you might see poor Palestinians who are kind of part of that workforce. A lot of people in the West Bank are actually forced to kind of migrate illegally to Israel proper, and they work there because they just don't have other jobs. Or a good amount of West Bank Palestinians are actually forced to work in settlements, which is the most like humiliating thing ever. They're essentially forced to dig their own graves because they can't find other jobs. But the reality is that Israel is able to operate a workforce without Palestinians. So they don't necessarily need Palestinians there. They have African Jews, they have Arab Jews. They're able to envision this racial ladder without Palestinians there. So they either want to kick them out completely, to kill them, they're just not reliant on them, or throw them in prison. Whereas in apartheid South Africa, they were reliant on that black workforce. So then we should ask the question of, so we've covered how Israel kind of has like a comparative historical parallel to apartheid South Africa, but we should now ask the question of how Israel fits the legal definition of apartheid. So international law defines apartheid as consisting of three primary elements: an intent to maintain a system of domination by one racial group or over another. So they have to essentially show that the government is intending to have one group be dominant over the other, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, and one or more inhumane acts carried out on a widespread or systematic scale. So Israel show intent to maintain racial domination. So the Israeli Knesset in 2018 passed a law affirming Israel as, quote, the nation state of the Jewish people, leaving out non-Jewish citizens, declaring that within Israel, self-determination is unique to the Jewish people. So they essentially say that non-Jews don't have self-determination here, and that establishing Jewish settlement is a national value. And Israeli government officials have also spoken openly about Palestinians as a demographic threat that they have taken efforts to curtail by limiting their ability to vote, move around, and receive state resources while increasing those resources to Jewish citizens. So Israel will take away resources from Palestinians and give those to Jewish citizens. And Israel has also made efforts to Judaize areas with large Palestinian populations, such as Jerusalem, as we're seeing in Sheikh Jarrah. This is an effort to Judaize the neighborhood and get Palestinians out. And you also see this in other places like the Negev and Golan and a lot of other places. So it's very clear that Israel intends to maintain a dominance of Jewish people, and particularly European Jews. And this actually, like, it's interesting because Israel kind of subverts the notion of citizenship. Citizenship is the notion of belonging to a country. If you are an American citizen, you have certain rights in the country that non-citizens don't. But in Israel, if you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel, a Jewish person from Miami has more rights with you in that state, even if they're not a citizen of that state, than you do as a citizen. So this sort of ethno-nationalism has kind of subverted even the purpose of citizenship. And then systematic oppression of Palestinians. I mean, you could have like 50 slides on this. But in the West Bank, Palestinians live under military law, while Israeli settlers live under civil law. They're not allowed to enter settlements, which is a system of forced segregation. Settlers can move around wherever they want. In Gaza, Israel has a land, sea, and air blockade that prevents critical resources necessary for survival from getting in, and also limits people from getting out. They get 4 hours of electricity a day. The UN said Gaza would be unlivable in 2020. Gaza is unlivable right now. If someone has cancer in Gaza, they're not able to get proper medical treatment. So there are many people in Gaza who literally die from stuff that they could have lived from if there wasn't this blockade. In Jerusalem, Palestinians lose their residency if they leave the city for 3 years. And this does not apply to Israelis living in the same area. So let's say you're a college student you're from Jerusalem, you live there all your life, and then you go to college in the US. And COVID happens and it's not really easy to move back and forth. Or let's say you just want to be in this university for 4 years. You come back later and the Israeli government tells you you no longer are allowed to live in Jerusalem as a resident. And for Israelis, this does not happen. You can leave for however long you want and come back whenever you want. And all of these varying degrees of oppression of Palestinians in different areas serve one goal, which is Jewish Israeli domination. And then inhumane acts carried out by Israel, restricting the movement of almost 5 million Palestinians, stealing land, bulldozing homes, denying citizenship and residence to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, blockading Gaza, bombing hospitals, mosques, schools, other civilian areas. So the legal definition of apartheid is a lower bar And it's very clear that Israel kind of fits that definition. And then we should also ask, well, why is the apartheid label important? The first reason it's important is because apartheid is a crime against humanity. So the International Criminal Court could prosecute the Israeli government for the crime of apartheid. The other reason it's important is we should reflect on how South Africans resisted and what we can learn from that in terms of what to do and what not to do. So how was South Africa, well, how was apartheid South Africa brought down, right? It was brought down through military kind of resistance. Nelson Mandela's organization was not nonviolent, right? They targeted the South African military, and in some cases they also targeted civilians. And they later on, post-apartheid, they said we shouldn't have done that. And this was a whole thing with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we should ask, when Palestinians resist militarily, is that wrong? And was it wrong when South Africans were doing it? Apartheid South Africa was also brought down through a system of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And there are all of these other ways. Just as Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years, we see so many important Palestinian political figures like Marwan Barghouti in prison today. So we can draw all of these parallels. And when Marwan Barghouti was actually first in prison, Ahmed Kusrada, Nelson Mandela's cellmate in jail, he launched the campaign to free Marwan Barghouti from their prison cell at Robben Island. We can reflect on the international solidarity campaign that put pressure on South Africa to end its policies of apartheid. We can also reflect on the transition from apartheid to democracy in South Africa. They had this kind of entire Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you can look at the shortcomings of that transition. Today in South Africa, Black South Africans, they have political freedom, but there's still kind of like an economic imbalance between white and Black South Africans. And we should also move out of the two-state framework. Anybody who seriously analyzes the issue knows there is no two-state solution. So we should look at kind of a one-state framework, such as that which exists in South Africa today, where white and Black and everything in the middle, South Africans, they are all citizens of the same state. So we should look at, could we create a framework where Palestinians and Israelis live under one state, under one flag, under a sort of binational government that gives equal rights to all from within the West Bank, within the 67 borders, within Gaza. And yeah, does anybody have any questions or any comments or anything?
Hamza, that was absolutely incredible. I don't know if I almost took someone's spot to secure their question. So informative. I really, yeah, opening up the space to anyone who'd like, can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Just a thumbs up if you can. Okay, awesome. Yeah, opening up the space for anyone to make any comment if they feel comfortable, or asking questions to Hamza, who did an amazing job explaining the parallels of apartheid in South Africa and connecting that to Palestine, to Palestine, so beautifully in such a simple manner and in a really informative manner. So Hamza, looks like you're getting a lot of fan love in the chat. No, I mean, I learned so much myself from this. I'm gonna pass it over to Salman, since he gets to share a gene pool with you. Salman, what are your thoughts on this?
It was extremely informative. A lot of stuff that I feel like I was pretty well versed on this before, but it just opened me up to a whole new world of information. I'm really appreciative of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Simone. Somebody has to have a question.
You guys, Hamza is awesome, and we'll break it down. If you have any questions or comments, please don't feel shy. Or if you want to directly message Hamza, please feel free to do so if you don't feel comfortable just hopping in right now.
Hi, I just had a quick question.
Mhm.
So going back to the college student example, where you said like if someone were to like move away from Palestine to another country for a few years and come back, would they find like their home like demolished, or would it just be like a forced relocation? Like what would the situation be like?
So they might find their home demolished, but their home would likely be demolished. Like them leaving does kind of open up that like issue, right? Like think about in Sheikh Jarrah right now, if the Kurd family wasn't there, kind of saying don't do this and kind of pushing this opposition, it's very easily that if it's an empty house, if there are less people there, there's a likelihood of it being demolished. But they would lose their residency status, so it would be illegal for them to live in Jerusalem if they were to leave for 3 years or more.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, and it's part of the Israeli effort to kind of make Jerusalem less and less Palestinian. I think right now, the city of Jerusalem is probably like 60 or 70% Palestinian, but the Jerusalem like city government only allocates them about 10% of resources. So 10% of resources go to 60 to 70% of the population, and 90% of resources go to about like 30 to 40% of the population.
Hi, I have a question. I didn't know if anyone else was like in front of me though. Or
Go for it.
again. So when it comes to Mizrahi Jews, I would like to know, like, were they initially met? Okay, maybe I should say Palestinian Jews, because I know that Palestine was like very mixed, right? Like there was a huge population of Christians there too. How were they met with Israel becoming a thing, I guess? Were they discriminated against as well? Or were they just included with Mizrahim?
So they were originally discriminated against. And there's an interesting group. It was called like the Jewish Black Panthers, I think it was called. And they were essentially like very anti-Zionist. But basically what has happened now is you'll find that Mizrahi Jews are even like just as right-wing or even more right-wing than European Jews. And it's similar to kind of like working class kind of white people in America. Like that's the kind of analogy I like to draw. Like working class white people, it's in their kind of best interest to align with, working class people of color. But they don't do that. And instead they kind of are the people who get like right-wing governments in the United States elected. And it's almost like this idea of like, I'm discriminated against and like my life is bad, but like, at least I'm not like those people below me. So instead of kind of building common cause with Palestinians, with Ethiopian Jews, Mizrahi Jews as an electoral group tend to kind of support like very right-wing policies.
I had no idea. Thank you so much for explaining that. Yeah. Wow, I'm blown away.
I have a quick question. So usually when we're confronted with like someone who is interested in learning more about Palestine, but they have a hard time like grasping the concept of a country being occupied in the 21st century, because like, when you think of occupation, this is like centuries ago, and it's not something that you could imagine happening today, when in fact it is. Would explaining to them like the parallels between South African apartheid and Palestinian apartheid be a good starting place, considering South Africa is something that people are just a little bit more knowledgeable about?
Maybe. I don't want to say for sure, but it could be a starting place. But I think also what's interesting about even apartheid in South Africa is like, when you ask people how long ago it was, they see it as something like really long ago. But in reality, apartheid ended in 1994. Like I was born in 1996. So it really was, it's a fairly recent phenomenon. And I think apartheid in South Africa, it also shows us that things may be really bad, but like freedom might be a lot closer than we think. And that, a way out is possible. Because it's interesting, even in the 80s and the 90s, if you ask most people who were around back then, they would say like apartheid is going to be here for a while. It just like is the way we do things. The regime is really brutal. It's very difficult to dissent. All the major dissenters are in jail right now. But I think the South African experience with apartheid shows Palestinians and those who are in solidarity with them that, there might be a way out closer than we think.
Yeah. It actually gives me a lot more hope, actually, because it does feel like a stuck place and like it's impossible to move on. But what you just said was very hopeful.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So, if I remember correctly, South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and the United States had, at least at the beginning of the Cold War, a fairly close or at least cooperative relationship. What led to the, I guess, strain in ties? What changed in the U.S. and do you think that there could be like a potential parallel in the future here for the problems in Palestine?
Yeah, what changed in the US is it started off with kids on college campuses who would talk about freeing Mandela, who would talk about boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against apartheid South Africa, stuff like that. And eventually, it just started off with young people. And then you kind of felt it with very few members of the Congressional Black Caucus. So you saw it with Congress people who would say that, the system is unjust and we should put sanctions on South Africa. But originally it was a very small amount of Congress people, and they were very much when they spoke out, they felt the brunt of it. And we see that parallel today. We have seen a lot of activism around Palestine on college campuses over the past 20 years or so, more so over the past really post 2014 was the very big turning point. So this is 8 years ago. And now we see kind of very, very small bits of that amongst Congress people, right? You see very few Congress people who will say, let's put sanctions on South Africa, on Israel. And those Congress people, they really face a lot of criticism for it, and they really get hit very hard. And it's actually interesting, Rashida Tlaib, she wanted to basically take a congressional delegation to Palestine, and Israel denied her entry. What a lot of people don't know is the district that she represents, 30 years before that, there was the congressperson who represented that district. He wanted to do a congressional delegation to South Africa, and the apartheid government denied him entry. So yeah, that's where it all starts. And just as, the United States-Israel relationship, though, is a lot stronger than United States support for South Africa. You would never have a member of Congress saying in the 80s or the 70s or the early 90s, wherever I stand with South Africa. You have seen many, many, American politicians say that about Israel. When you go to AIPAC and you see the way that these politicians talk about Israel, particularly these right-wing evangelical Christians, it's pretty weird, the kind of passion that they'll have. And oftentimes it's not very sincere. It's just a means of appealing to evangelical voters. So that's an obstacle that we would have with Israel that we wouldn't have with apartheid South Africa.
I think it's interesting you mentioned that because I have older family members who fall into that category of evangelical voters. And they're some of the most anti-Jewish people I know. And yet they're extremely supportive of the state of Israel. It's just a weird contradiction.
The head of Christians United for Israel, John Hagee, he's a major anti-Semite. So it's crazy when this is another very interesting thing. These Congress people who were Palestinian solidarity activists, most of the ones that you meet, they're super multicultural. They're these hippies who are down with everything, right? They're cool with everyone. They don't have an anti-Semitic bone in their body. And the second they say hey, I think it's wrong that Israel doesn't give clean water to people in Gaza, they get called anti-Semites. Meanwhile, these same right-wing politicians will be speaking at AIPAC with people from Christians United for Israel, who the only reason that they support the Zionist project is based on this evangelical idea that in order to bring the second coming of Christ quicker, we need to bring all the Jews to one place. So if we support Israel, this Messiah is going to basically bring all the Jews to one place where they'll have the choice to like convert or die before the end of the world comes. So it's like the anti-Semitism card that's like played on Palestinian solidarity activists. The fact that these same people waging that critique are super comfortable hanging out with groups like Christians United for Israel and like anti-Semites just shows that it's not a very sincere critique.
Thank you. You just brought back some flashbacks from Sunday school growing up. Some of the words you just said, very, very relevant, I think. But thank you so much for your presentation. It's informative.
So I have a question on if you were asked about a two-state solution, how would you explain it to someone who like doesn't know much about Palestine, and kind of like the two-state solution, why it wouldn't actually, it's actually not a solution, 101 kind of answer.
Yeah. One, I don't think you have to right away. So I think right away you can just be like, the occupation's bad. Palestinians should have the right of return. We should engage in a set of like solidarity tactics. And whether they want like whether we want a 1 or 2 state solution is a decision that Palestinians and Israelis will make when they are brought to the negotiating table. But our job as people kind of engaging in solidarity efforts is to rid this imbalance of power and kind of bring them to the negotiating table. So that would be kind of the way I would approach it. But I mean, what state is left for Palestinians? Here, let me just, I can share my screen, right? Like if you pull up like just a map of like Palestinian loss of land. Like there's no like state left for Palestinians to kind of live in. And like even the 67 borders, like 2-state solution, do we really want a solution where half the people get 22% of the land, which is like the least fertile part of the land? And under international law, Palestinians have the right of return. So Palestinians expelled from what would be that other state, they would be forced to basically live under, and then they would be forced to live under like a Zionist state. And then the other question comes about is even like Palestinian citizens of Israel, they don't have equal citizenship because Zionism is built on like this ethno-nationalism. So we're not just against displacement and all this sort of stuff, but we're against 2-state solution. I would say I'm against a 2-state solution also because I don't believe that any government or any state should be based on racial supremacy or religious supremacy or any of this sort of stuff. So if Israel stopped occupying the West Bank and Gaza today, it would still be a problem because they don't treat racial and religious minorities right, even within the 67 borders.
Awesomely put. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was a great way. Oh,
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
no, sorry, Hamzah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say in South Africa, they also had this idea of what they called like Bantustans. Can you guys see my screen? You guys can't see my screen, right? Here, let me just share my screen. So they had this idea of Bantustans, which were kind of like, it was kind of like a 2-state solution, essentially. Where's my, here's. So it was essentially like these independent Black homelands that would be like these kind of yeah, so the colored areas are basically where non-white people would live, and they were called Bantustans. So this was actually an idea in apartheid South Africa also, that, oh, we'll kind of create the state for Black people and the state for white people. And it never happened because in practice, like this just wouldn't make any sense.
Thank you for that, Hamzah. I did want to say, going to your point about the 2-state versus the 1-state, to those who are non-Palestinian and who are Palestinian or who are allies, I think the question, it's very informative. And I think a lot of folks ask it to genuinely get opinions on, and just like basic knowledge, right, on your stance on land and what Palestinians believe is the right to return. But I also feel like this question is offensive in itself, because when folks, whether it's politicians, whether it's Zionists, whether it's people who are anti-Palestinian, ask this. They have the intention to belittle your conversation, belittle your intent, belittle your how you go about talking about Palestine and talking about the issues going on. It's steering away from the conversation that you're intending on having. It's steering away from the right of return of millions and millions and millions of Palestinians, and it's steering away from the diaspora, right? Like it's steering away from what Palestinians carry on a daily basis, which is resisting to exist and speaking on occupation. So I just wanted to make that clear. So it is important to differentiate the differences between a one state and a two state, and it's important to understand that one state is the only way to go and a two state is impossible. But it's also important that to know that that question being asked by politicians, Zionists, and so many individuals is so offensive to our conversation and what Palestinians have when they're speaking to the right of return. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Okay.
If anyone else has anything like comments, whether it's questions they'd like to make, please feel
Yeah,
free.
I have. Sorry, Surya. I have a comment. I don't have a question though, but I just wanted to say that I really genuinely enjoyed this teach-in. I learned so much, and as I'm a Palestinian, I didn't know half of the things that you just explained, and you explained it with so much ease. So I just want to thank you for that, and it was a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much, Hamzah.
Yeah, thank you for coming out.
Thank you, Hamza. Thank you, Tala, for that. So it is 6:29, so we are good on time. I'm gonna take this time to close us out right now. I want to thank, first of all, Hamza for being on the call with us and performing such an incredible job with, just going through the parallels between South Africa to Palestine on the apartheid situations. I also want to thank you for your time here. Again, I said earlier on the call that Hamza is pinged in from Masr, Egypt, so it's a 7-hour time difference. Hamza, I don't mean to put you on blast, but Hamza is actually studying Arabic in Egypt. That's really awesome. So if anyone on the call, if you feel comfortable, Hamza has any questions regarding that for those who aren't Arabic learners or speakers, and who want to become learners, if you want to hit up Hamza, I think he's your guy on not just apartheid, but in Arabic learning, specifically Fusha. So, but yeah, so thank you so much, Hamza, for being here and having such an incredibly informative event. Again, we appreciate you, not just the PSA board members, but I'm sure all of us here on the call today. And for those who are going to be watching after we post our recording. So thank you, Hamza, so much.
Yeah, thank you
I'll
so
give a
much
clap.
for having me.
I'm gonna also thank our board members, Salman, our treasurer, Neda, our event coordinator, Bara, our student advisor, Noor, our vice president. We also have Tala, our secretary, for doing such an incredible job this semester, for helping host this event, for planning and for preparing, and for doing so much for this club and this organization. And thank you guys so much. These are incredible people.
We can't forget about Suidia, the president, right here.
Okay.
Quick shout out to Suidia for always
Thanks,
having
Noor.
the best ideas and engaging people all the time.
Thanks, Noor. It's so heartbreaking to talk. Uh-oh, co-host has stopped your video. Dang,
Yeah,
Hamza.
I'm sorry.
Dang.
I was trying to make you the host, but I realized you're already the host. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. He's
That's
mad that he's mad that I put him on blast for his Arabic learning in Egypt. Anyway, so yeah, thank you guys so much. So just for near future events, for those who are still on the call, which I see a lot of people still, PSA is having a Kahwa social next Tuesday, inshallah. And Neda, our event coordinator, is doing lots of works with having that for you guys and having so many incredible things to push out to students. and maybe a Debka night. So if you do know how to do Debka and you're good at it, or you feel comfortable teaching, please message the UCF Pals on Instagram, and we can talk more about Debka.
And one thing actually, it hasn't officially been announced, but so the PSA is also part of something called the UMO, which is the Union of Muslim Organizations, and it's basically just a collective of different Muslim organizations. And while like Palestine, of course, our club isn't religious, many of the members are Muslim, so you know they're also part of this collective. And next Friday, February 4th, from 4 to 8, we're actually having a UMO picnic in order to celebrate Islam Appreciation Month. So it's going to be a month long of different events speaking about Islam. And our first event is the UMO picnic, and it's a potluck as well. So more information will be posted about that on both the MSA page as well as the PSA page. And yeah, we hope to see you there.
Thank you, Noor. Noor is our MSA president, if you guys don't know also. So she's a great person to reach out to if any religious questions on campus.
MSA does rock. Yeah.
MSA does rock. MSA and PSA. Yeah, so anyone that has anything else to say, this is your time. And again, if you don't feel comfortable, please message Hamzah privately, or even one of us, any of the board members, so you can see our name and title right there. But thank you guys so much for coming out to this event. We would have liked to have done this in person, where we would have seen Hamzah's face on the big screen, but it's okay. Nonetheless, we're going to be pushing out more events to you guys. Hopefully so many more teach-ins where you guys can learn so much. I learned so much. I know all of us here learned so much. So again, thank you so much, Hamzah, for making this happen today. I don't think anyone, yeah. Also, Salman is Hamzah's cousin, guys. Pretty cool, pretty cool. Just wanted to put that out there. Okay, it was so nice having everyone be on this call. Thank you guys so much. If you guys don't already, please follow UCF Palestine on Instagram, where we post all of our events and everything that you guys can stay posted with us through there. And yeah, if you guys want to give Hamzah a shout out, his Instagram is also on our Instagram, where we have our post for this event. So give shout out to Hamzah for being such an incredible speaker and teaching so much about apartheid. Thank you, Hamzah. And thank you to everyone who came in. Bye, everyone. You guys can go off mute and say bye to everybody if you guys like. Oh, Shaban, you can stay actually. Oh, 1 second. Oh, did Hamzah leave? Oh,
He did.
I was gonna. Oh, that's not good. Oh,
Tell him to join again. Thanks for coming, guys.
Shaban, we missed you. OMG. How was graduation life?
guys,
I just kicked them out.
I didn't know what to do. We're just waiting on people to leave.
Okay. I was like, somebody else left.
Damn, someone's gonna kick me out.
We were just waiting on people to leave.
It's a month.
Oh, but Tan and Bara are together. Okay, awesome. Oh, bored. Wait. Oh, I was like, we're missing
everyone smile.
Yeah, we should get a picture. Hold on. Okay,
He's joining the call again.
What?
He's joining the call. I told him.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Wait, why?
Wait, you guys said you wanted him to come back.
Yeah, so we can discuss.
Yeah, go on. He can be on the call.
Wait, everybody,
let's
look
take
at
a
this
picture.
beautiful. Okay.
Oh my god, the chaos. It's so chaotic. First of all, Shaban, I told you that I missed you and you just stayed quiet. I'm hurt.
Everyone just talked over us.
Siri, did you take the picture?
Huh?
Yeah, I
Everyone just
did.
talked over us.
You're still posing.
Wait, y'all took a picture already? Hey, Shaban, how's it going?
Hi, Vara'a, how are you?
Oh, we
I
miss
want to
you.
talk, but I'm shy.
How's post-college life?
I'm just working a lot. Is Hamzah back in here? Oh no.
Yes. Wait, why isn't he there?
Yeah, there he is.
Hey Hamza, assalamu alaikum.
Hi,
Hamza, you
Hamza.
didn't have to leave, silly. You really made it back.
Thank you so much,
Hamza,
Hamza.
Yeah.
oh, Hamza's like, freak these kids. Hamza, I wanted to just say thank you so much on a personal level. Seriously, like I learned so much from this call today. I already knew going in about like parallels to South Africa to Palestine and like kind of like a history, but
This is on a whole other
you
level.
shed
This is
so
like
much
some-
information about this. You're so well versed on this. You are so knowledgeable on this. And honestly, like I was telling, I sent a message in our group chat. I was like, if everyone or anyone that is listening with ears and who understands English, would just sit here and listen for like the 30 minutes to an hour that he's speaking, would just understand that Israel's an apartheid state. So it's just, you know, really incredible, so well versed, mashallah. Thank you so much. It's really important to have these conversations to students, as I'm sure you know you were once a student. And it's a great way to get information directly from someone who's well versed on this and who was in the position that we're all in right now. So jazakallah so much for everything today.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so
Well,
go ahead,
I've
Chapman.
heard so much about you through your brother and Salman. Like I've always told him I wanted to meet you. Like I've heard about the walkout you did in Harvard and all that stuff, and I think it's incredible. And like the things I see about you on the internet and what I hear about you from your family, it's like two different people. So the way you're able to like carry yourself in such a professional outlet and still have like a fun side is really cool. And I'm happy you finally got to meet. And thank you so much for
Yeah,
coming
bro.
out to the club and just speaking here.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Yeah. You're Adam's cousin also, right?
Yeah, I'm Adam's cousin.
Yeah.
It was really cool when we found out that my best friends, our cousins, are best friends with each other too. And me and Salman
Yeah.
are best friends too.
Yeah. Adam was at my house like when was this? In the summer.
Really?
Yeah.
You moved to Egypt recently though, right?
Yeah, I moved in September. So Adam was at my house like maybe like a month or two before I came here.
Wow.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah.
But your brother was here recently. Like I heard a lot of, I mean, not, I won't say in front of the board, but you guys are, I'd love to hang out sometimes with your family one day.
Oh, what did you hear?
Not, I mean, just the Mercedes story.
I actually don't know the Mercedes story. My brother doesn't tell me anything.
Okay, I'll stay between you and Salman then, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, Mom, did I tell you the story when I was driving them to the airport?
For when he came last year, no.
Oh, so I can tell this story in front of the board, but I was like basically telling them, I was like, yeah, you know, like make sure like when you're in Florida, like you like pray your salahs like this and this, right? My little brother's friend, he's like a Hafiz, but like outside of Ramadan, like I don't know what he's doing. So I basically tell this kid, I'm like, you guys are traveling, like you guys can combine, like it's not a big deal, right? This kid says to me, he's like, this is my little brother's friend. He's a college roommate also. He's like, no. He's like, you can't combine salats. Like in the Hanafi school, like we don't combine. And I was like, yeah, like you can just like not be Hanafi for like the week. And this kid's like, no, he's like, you can't because if you do that, you're like following your desires. So like I stick to like the Hanafi madhab. And I like look at this kid, I'm like, you don't even pray. Like just combine your salats.
Oh my gosh.
Those are the same guys who tell girls to fix their hijab.
Yeah. Kids, they're the worst.
Oh my god.
Oh my god.
Oh man, Hamza, you were quite funny. I will
Oh yeah, guys.
Syria.
You're just on mute.
So if you're co-hosting,
Wait, what was the Mercedes story? I want to hear this story.
no, that's Salman tell you. It's not my
Oh
business
my
to say.
god.
I don't even
I actually don't know
is-
the Mercedes story.
Is it just
Apparently, no. Apparently, Charvan is the only one who actually knows the Mercedes story.
Okay. Remember when your brother rented the car, or your cousin rented the car?
Oh yeah.
Wait, I don't know this story. Here, let's talk about this another time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys should talk about it another time. Does anyone have any last things they'd like to say to Hamza before we hop off the call? Oh, I do want to say, shout out guys for being here on time. Thank you so much, Salman. But Noor,
on time, but
and
I apologize.
Tala and Nada for being on time and being great in communication. Jazakallah khair for your efforts, guys. I'm really proud of you. And even though this was online, we had such a good turnout today from our numbers that we were looking at.
Yeah.
Also, shout out to Tala who made the Zoom link and she made the registration. Shout out Tala, not Sala. And I'm just really proud
Shout
of you
out
guys.
to
And I'm honest.
Surya. Shout out to my girl Surya. Una reverse card for yeah.
You have to take the recognition. Don't be shy.
Literally.
You do so much for this organization. Surya.
Everyone clap for studio
You're
right now.
absolutely
Okay,
amazing.
Noor.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, wallahi. But your efforts don't go
Okay.
unnoticed at all.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate that from the bottom of my heart. That's very sweet. Again, thank you guys so much. Hamzah, I'm really glad that you got to meet our alumni president, Shaban Ghiz. He was on the board last semester and he was a great leader. He's still a great leader. And I'm really happy that he was able to be on call today. He really wanted to meet you from like we all did. And we're just really happy that alhamdulillah today went awesome. So thank you, Hamzah, again. And we would love to collab soon, anytime that you have the capacity to. Because as much as we got educated today, I'm sure there's still so much that we can learn from you and your time at Harvard and your time at the walk-in. And I think even like just like the story behind you organizing that is so incredible. And as student activists, I think navigating ways that we can like really shed light on Palestine and you doing that in such a beautiful effort that went viral everywhere and that was still talked about to this day is iconic. So I would love for one day maybe we can go on Instagram Live and you could share that story because it's pretty cool that we have you on the call with us and you were the one that organized that event. Something so phenomenal, mashallah. So awesome work, Hamzah. Thank you so much. And thank you guys all for being here. I'm going to close this out. I hope everyone had a great day and great time. And I hope everyone gets home safe if you're not home already. Hamzah, hope you have a good sleep in Masr. And Salman, thank you so much. Actually, this is all Salman's. Honestly, shout out Salman because if he never talked about his cousin, we never would have figured out who Hamzah Raza is. So thank you, Salman, so much.
I will take the credit for the entire event. Thank you.
All right,
This is
never
all
mind.
Salman.
Oh, you know what?
Let me take your
Okay. I take everything I said about Salman. Actually, no, Salman, have the glory. It's okay. This is your cousin. But thank you guys so much. It was good seeing everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
You so
Thank you so much,
much.
Hamzah. It was great to meet you.
Yeah.
I'll stop recording.